Turning to a different matter now, the Gauteng Division of the High Court in Pretoria has issued an order to set aside the latest arms export permits. That's for transfers from South Africa to Myanmar. It's also declared that the committee in charge of these permits must suspend any permit if the country in question underwent a military coup, or if a UN mandate holder accused the state in question of having committed war crimes or genocide. To unpack this, we're joined now by Dr. Atilla Kisla of the Southern Africa Litigation Centre. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. What's your reaction to the latest court outcome? Surely it must come as a relief.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me, firstly. Yes, certainly. It is an application that we filed in October 2022, and we filed that application based on the developments in Myanmar and the accusations of genocide and serious human rights violations from 2016 and 2017. We had throughout the years in 2018 UN expert reports concluding that there are reasonable grounds to believe that genocide was committed in Myanmar by Myanmar authorities against the Rohingya people. In 2019, we had an ICC investigation. In 2020, we had even the International Court of Justice issuing provisional measures in relation to potential breaches of the Genocide Convention against Myanmar, the same way the International Court of Justice did now in the case of Palestine. And on top of that, in February 2021, we had a military coup that overtook power in the country. And despite all these developments and words of condemnation by the South African authorities and concern, we have seen throughout the years from 2017 until 2021 that South Africa has been exporting arms to Myanmar, and therefore the order that was granted by the High Court in Pretoria is certainly a relief, as it addresses these most recent export permits from South Africa to Myanmar, but also it declares that if there is a country that has experienced an unconstitutional change of government, or where UN experts have concluded that that country is reasonably suspected of committing crimes against humanity, war crimes, or genocide, that those permits facilitating arms transfers must be suspended. So in that regard, the order ensures that if there are any valid permits out there applying these situations, that those permits must be suspended.
Yeah. What were some of the more profound concerns you had noted, more so as you found that some contradictions were in place to South Africa's foreign policy position on Myanmar at the time when it came to the authorization of arms exports to the country?
Specifically with respect to Myanmar, we had various statements. For instance, in 2018, in the year where we had all these UN expert reports coming out, that actually the DIRCO minister expressed deep concern about the situation in Myanmar and the Rohingya people in Myanmar. And that continued. In February 2019, we had the South African permanent representative to UN Security Council condemning the violence that took place in Rakhine State. And on the day of the military coup, we had a DIRCO media statement calling on the military to respect the rule of law and return to a democratic rule of law. In June 2021, after the military coup, South Africa even voted in favor of a UN General Assembly resolution that called for a global arms embargo for transfers to Myanmar. But despite these words of condemnation and concern, we have seen throughout the years in the reports that were handed over to the Parliament that South Africa continued until 2021 to deliver arms, and that raises the question of whether South Africa is applying a different standard, or if there's a double standard occurring when it comes to arms exports from South Africa to the respective nations.
What kind, as we look at the bigger picture, the implications, what kind of implications could this ruling now have for South Africa's arms exports to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which are, of course, accused of committing war crimes in Yemen?
Exactly. That's another situation that is in which the order might potentially apply, because with respect to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, UN expert reports have throughout the years have accused and actually concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed by these countries in the conflict in Yemen. So under the order that was issued by the court, those permits, if there are still valid permits out there, those permits would have to be suspended and would certainly have an impact on the South African arms exports to these countries. However, these are not the only countries on that list. Why the order is also so important is actually that this order is in line with what was highlighted by the president in his inauguration speech, where he highlighted that the GNU parties are actually committed to pursue a foreign policy based on human rights, solidarity, and peace. And this was also later on confirmed by Minister Lamola, who spoke of a fair application of international law for all. So it's certainly, there's a commitment by the current government to pursue a foreign policy based on international law and human rights. And the order is certainly, in that regard, confirming that commitment. And whether there are arms exports that will be suspended, that will depend on the NCACC, who has the obligation to suspend these permits.
As you speak about those bold commitments, really just charting a way forward on this matter, what kind of perception do you think this court now sets in terms of how South Africa is perceived?
I think it raises serious questions about South Africa's commitment to pursue a foreign policy based on human rights and international law. The arms exports, even though they occurred from 2017 to 2021, they show that there, like I said, a different standard was applied, and the arms exports to countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE support that statement. So it is now up to the state to decide whether it truly wants to live up to its standard that it set for itself and pursue a foreign policy based on human rights, based on and guided by international law, or whether it will take the risk to damage its own credibility that it has just gathered in the past months, becoming a champion of human rights and standing up for the Palestinian people in the Gaza situation. So this can certainly have an impact and direct the foreign policy of South Africa in the near future.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in and joining us on this conversation there, just expanding the nitty-gritties of that court outcome, the Gauteng Division of the High Court in Pretoria issuing an order now setting aside the latest arms export permits for transfers from South Africa to Myanmar. Speaking there to Dr. Atilla Kisla of the Southern Africa Litigation Centre.